it is, this you make the point in your book that in order to kind of really address these large and vexing questions, there is the need for a kind of a somewhat cohesive society where you can take those debates and find common solutions without it kind of deteriorating into and having the ridiculous luck here in life of being born in Norway, as a very peaceful, cohesive, and also, by geological luck, a very affluent society. I mean, I think it's a bit difficult to really fathom the challenges that many people around the world are facing. And you have traveled around the world, you've seen it firsthand, you worked with peace on the ground. Many business people around the world, and in the Western world, we are too far removed to really quite understand what is going on the ground. And just one thing that just strikes me that when it comes to kind of human life, that the need to belong to something, the need, or in order to, you're willing to accept or believe or say a lot of strange things, or we may deem them strange, in exchange for a sense of belonging. For people to feel, and I think that's part of, maybe that we see also in the States and many places, the divide between the left and the right, and people have a strong need to belong to something, and I think, at least from my end, what I think is a crucial point here is that if you close the re-entry door, if you make it difficult for people to come back into mainstream society, then you will forever create a division that is basically impossible to heal. And I think you talk, of course, quite a bit of terrorism in your book, and when young children have nowhere else to go than to basically crime or terrorism, it is, from their point of view, it's quite understandable that that's the path they take, given their circumstance, right? There is simply no, it's a matter of maybe survival. But I think the rest of society, we need to always keep that door open so we can, welcome them back in. I think we need to adopt a different mindset when it comes to, people in different situations around the world and their actions. I don't know if there's any comments to that, or if that kind of resonates with some of your work.
Yeah. Look, so some of the places I've been, I've seen some horrible things, unbelievable. But on the other hand, I've seen people in the worst of circumstances struggle and overcome. Like this one guy I know in Kenya. He now runs a hostel, I guess would be the right word, for about 600 kids in Kenya. And so he started off, his parents couldn't look after him. He lived on the streets of Nairobi from a young age, and it would have been about 16, okay, and he hadn't eaten for 2 days, and he was just trying to get some food, and couldn't get, and went up to this house and said to knocked on the door and said to the lady, "Oh, can you give me some food?" And she said, "No, go away." And he says, "Look, I'll do anything. You give me a bit of food. I just want some food." And she looked at him and somehow felt sorry for him and said, "Oh, come on in, sweep the yard, and I'll give you some food." So swept the yard, and Evelyn was pretty industrious at it. So she said, "Oh, you can sleep there for the night." And he slept there for the night, and he'd eaten. He said he can't tell you how content he felt sleeping somewhere where he wasn't worried about his personal safety, and he actually had food in his stomach. Anyway, she kept him on working there for a couple of months, and all he got was food and somewhere to sleep. That was it. Then after a couple of months, this guy was bright and industrious. She said to her husband, "Look, you should take this guy and employ him in your factory." So the husband did it. brought him in, employed him in the factory. So then the guy from there, he was pretty industrious, moved up to become a foreman, then moved up further on, was entrepreneurial, so he bought his own taxi. Then taxis expanded into buses, and then ended up, that's the only you can do in Kenya, with the LPG monopoly for Kenya, and ended up really rich businessman. And then at some point he had this cathartic experience, and like I won't go through the details, but the cathartic experience where he went back to the roots, realised the roots from which he came. He felt he had to then go out and dedicate the rest of his life to helping those kids who'd been like him. And like that's transformational story. Give you another one. This is out the other end. Okay, so we worked on the rehabilitation of child soldiers in northern Uganda, and these stories are in the book. But rehabilitation of child soldiers in northern Uganda, captured by the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA. And the boys, 80% of the ones they captured were boys aged 7 to 10. Girls were sort of usually around the 16 age mark. And the kids, as they're taking them back to where they came from, if they were slow, if they cried, or if they grumbled, they'd beat them to death. What they'd do is get the kids, and they'd just captured to beat these kids to death. Then the soldiers would be over the top of the kids they'd just captured, beating them, so they wouldn't stop beating the other kids to death. And that was the way they were taken in. Within quite often months, sometimes a year, they'd go back and raid the villages where the kids came from and force them to kill someone in the village, sometimes their own parents. That's why there'd be no escape. They couldn't go back to where they came from, and then they'd be their family, as you mentioned earlier on, and that's the way they would refer to it, was the LRA. It's probably the most brutal organisation I've ever come across, made Islamic State look tame by comparison. Anyway, we're down there looking at the projects one day, and we're sitting in one of the forerunners, which was going to become the IDP camps down there, which ended up housing 2 million people. And there would be this guy there who he'd act as a mentor for the kids. This would get the kids back when they escaped from the LRA or they were captured by the Ugandan army. And he'd act as a mentor for them. This woman walked past and says, "Oh, she's just arrived here. I haven't seen her before. Let's pull her over and let's hear her story." She had a face like a face I hadn't seen before. It was so disfigured. And sat down and started to tell a story. And she was captured by the LRA when she was 16. She was given to one of the commanders. She had one child there. That child died. And then sort of what happened, she got caught. She used to have to carry the commander's goods, got caught in a firefight. And the disfiguration on her face was because they cut nose and her lips off, because she had dropped the commander's gear on the battlefield and they'd lost it. She eventually escaped from the LRA, got captured by another guy in southern Sudan, had another child by him, it died. Then sort of he got down into, eventually got away from him, got down into Uganda, and was then eventually able to team up with her sister. And sort of that's when she turned up in this camp. So I asked her, "Gee, what would you like?" And she said, "Oh, gee, all I want to do is go back to school." And she was 23 now, 24, I think. And so she was well outside the bounds of the program we were doing, because it was with kids. And what I realised then, when she said that, all she wanted to do was go back to the life before she was captured. So we put in a special intervention. So we got her checked out medically. She had tuberculosis. She had the STDs. She had also had AIDS. We sort of advanced set of AIDS. We stitched up what we could do for her, and then she died 3 months later.
Yeah.
So that's the story from the edges of hell. But on the other hand, you can, as they move into other environments, you move other stories, and they're massively uplifting.
Yeah, that story in your book is just heartbreaking, and it was really moving to read. And And this is I think is fascinating with your experience is that you are you've been in business, you're an entrepreneur, you're a tech entrepreneur, but you also spend so much time researching peace, working with peace, getting down into the trenches, if you will, in trying to understand it and combat it. So it's that journey is so interestingly explained in your told in your book. So it's thank you for that. And it's I think if more business people really understood the effect of their supply chain, the effect on commerce in local societies, the things far removed, but if they truly had that appreciation, my guess is that they would also be a bit more business worthy in their business dealings, that they would make sure that employees were properly treated and paid, regardless of where in the world they were operating. And but there seems to be, as further away you get from your core market or your factory, the more and more opaque the supply chain becomes, and the less and less accountable you feel for anything that happens in it. And I think that's um, so it's
Well, yeah, well, it gets hard. Like, let's say you're sourcing your goods from somewhere in Asia. You've got a supply chain down there. You're sitting in the head office in the senior management position. You've got some managers under you which are managing that, which then push it out to other people who are probably based out in Asia. You then go out and negotiate the contracts in those environments, and it gets hard. But look, things like this come back to just sort of be looking at supply chain management. Sort of in the long run, what's important is having a sustainable supply chain. And one of the things we can see with COVID, which I think is incredibly important, is just what happens quite often in the push for efficiency. We end up becoming a lot more fragile, so that your small shocks can have massive rippling effects. So where are we now? Like, we're over a year since the beginning of COVID, and just the shipping of containers around the world haven't got back to balance yet. Because we ended up all these containers in places where they didn't have anything to put into them to send back. Still getting issues with supply chains in a whole range of different areas. And so, sort of, one of the angles of this is, if you've got multiple suppliers, it's a little bit more in managing the quality aspects, let's say, or other aspects, but it does give you more choice. And so that means that if you do have audits of your supply chain and you find suppliers which sort of aren't meeting ethical standards, you've got the ability to switch. If you've all got one supplier, then you're quite often locked in, and you're more likely to turn a blind eye.
Yeah, it's one of it's a great concern of mine. Is something that the Business for Peace Foundation is eagerly trying to address. Just moving, staying at work for a bit. We talked about it a little bit initially. We are, as many people call it, we're entering the fourth industrial age. We have seen over, for a long time, and continuing unabatedly, an exponential growth in technology and anything relating to it. This seems to be kind of a fundamental change in humanity. Right? We are now at a brink of being able to influence our own evolution. I mean, we have made some extraordinary advances across a number of fields, and this will clearly change the future. It will change how we live and work on this planet. And to me, it just seems that it is likely to fundamentally change the future of work. In the industrial age, we could absorb millions and millions of people coming out of agriculture, going into a industrial assembly line. Those, as we go more and more digital, if you will, those jobs, the entry level jobs, or solid middle class jobs, are likely to, at least the traditional ones, are likely to disappear. I hear everyone talking about there will be new jobs and new industries coming up, and clearly there will be. And it's my imagination is probably not good enough to envision all of them, but we can see them coming up. But we also have take particularly the global south. I mean, a large portion of the population is under 25. We need to create jobs, assuming that many of the existing jobs will disappear. We need to create new, well-paying, meaningful jobs in the millions in the next decade across the world, not just in the global south, but also in the industrialized world. Without doing so, I would argue that we would make this inequality problem even bigger. We would make the fragmentation that is going on in the democracies around the world, where it becomes difficult to agree on sensible policies. These things will just escalate unless we are able to also provide sensible, meaningful employment, and through that, a decent life for people. What is your take as a technologist? What is your take on the future of work?
Yeah, well, it's good to predict the future, but you don't want to be reminded of it a decade later. So I'll start with that. So look, it's complex. Okay, so if we look at it, the pace of technological change is increasing all the time. So there's issues with that around government and the ability to be able to pass laws and regulations. So as technology advances, it's only at some stage after that, when you start to see issues and problems with it, do governments actually pass regulations to regulate it, okay? And so we may see that with the speculation in cryptocurrency, which is happening now. May be around privacy of data in a social media age. It may be around just what you can and can't say on social media through hate speech and other sorts of things as well. So this first thing, so that gap between the ability to be able to regulate and the pace of technological change, that'll increase, okay? So it'll also, if you've got that as well, you've got to increase the rate of which you can pass the appropriate legislations as well, because your bank of things which you've got to get on top of is growing. So I think that's an issue for society going forward, which no one's actually really looking at the moment. So that'd be the first thing I'd say. If you went down to sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, you'll find the unemployment rates of 40 to 60% in a whole range of different places, like figures we can't actually get our head around. And so it's a lot of discussion around things like expert systems, AI, getting rid of all the jobs where people think, okay? Because we see now you can get a machine which can play chess better than us, therefore they must be able to think better than us. But human beings by nature want to be productive. They want to produce, okay? Otherwise, we would never be where we are now. We'd be a bit like our pet dog. As soon as we got a good feed, we'd go to sleep. But that's not in the nature of human beings. So we will, within us, there's an innate drive to produce. So the form of production going forward could end up in many, many different areas. It could be in the areas of creative. It can be in the areas of intercommunal skills. It can be in terms of sport and adventure. So all these soft industries are likely to come up. So I just can see in Australia, I can compare back to 30 years ago, the number of places where you can go and get a massage today, or you can go and get kinesiology, or any form of different treatment, meditation, all these different things. So there's all these other service industries, if you're right, which aren't necessarily consuming a lot of the environment, can come up. But, and this is the but, what we're finding with technology, wealth is getting concentrated in some very, very few areas. And look, I'm not opposed to people getting filthy rich. In fact, I'm right in my heart, I'm pure capitalist. But there does need to be ways of being able to take some of this wealth and then work out how do you redistribute it to other people. And so this redistribution of wealth will create a flow-on effect as the wealth gets spent. So look, for every dollar produced, for example, when we're looking at GDP, it usually has about a three times flow-on effect with value added through as it moves through the economy. So if it gets captured by one person, it doesn't actually end up there because that money then gets kept and might be invested, but it doesn't get spent and consumed. So it's really important for governments to have the right policies in place to redistribute the wealth. I think one of the other things with business too, seeing we're on it, is that if we look at the origins of money within our society, all money comes from business, okay? So it's us productively trading. That's the origins of all money. Governments can print it, okay, but we'll leave that one aside for the moment. But we do know where generally that has ended up historically in the past with runaway inflation. Not here now, but historically in the past, that's where it's ended up. But if we look at it, so the wealth, and governments get their money through taxation, okay? That taxation comes from individuals or from corporations. The individuals get their money from wages. The money comes from, the wages come from business. If we look at our universities, they're funded through a government. They do a lot of innovative and creative things. But again, the origins of that money comes through business. So at the end of the day, businesses, vibrant business environments, vital, absolutely vital for the functioning of any society.
You touch on regulation and wealth distribution, and back to business and politics, and maybe a global collaboration around this. I mean, it seems to be almost the opposite, that countries are competing to provide, the lowest level of taxation, and this is an ongoing debate. And we have here in Norway, we have had this discussion, and it's a heated debate in this upcoming election this year as well. How realistic is it that we actually be able to kind of move these regulation, to scale around the world? I mean, it's not something that one country can do on their own. I mean, you need to, if you're going to have a global, a more equitable distribution of wealth around the world, it must be a global project. I mean, it's not something that one country on their own can do. Then people will just, companies will relocate.
So the first thing I'd say is that when we're looking in the way we look at things, equitable distribution of resources, there isn't some magic number which says that this is what equitable means. It's more the social contract within the society of what the society thinks is equitable. So I think that's the first thing. It's a relative value based on the precepts of the society and what they think is the social contract for equitable. So that's the first thing I'd say. And so that sort of exists somewhat independent of your taxation rates. So now what we can see is that the OECD at the moment's got a working group going on, which are looking at setting up new rules by which corporations are taxed. Okay, and that's because if you look at it, then you take your large multinationals with their transfer pricing, and then sort of the various corporate holding accounts in the tax havens. A lot of the time they're paying a very, very little tax compared to what they're actually really earning. And we know for many of them, like you're looking at quite often trillions of dollars held in offshore bank accounts. And huge amounts of cash which don't get taxed. So the OECD is looking at ways of being able to do this, and I'd expect within the next 2 years you start to see it being tackled. Because let's face it, most governments they've got a tension here. One is they want the money from tax so that they can fund programs, because the funding of those programs helps them get elected. So in Australia here, we've got an election coming up in the next 6 months or so, most likely. Hasn't been called, but most likely. And the government's just released a big spending program, sort of with the childcare rebates in it, more money for aged care, other sorts of social spending. And this is a Conservative government. Now, on the other hand, is everyone likes a lower tax rate. Everyone wants to pay less tax. So from the government, it's stuck between the two, okay? So they're stuck between the two. So they can work out ways of being able to all agree on what is ways of being able to tax, which are fair and equitable globally. And a lot of this will be on corporations and big multinational corporations. Then that's one way of being able to pick up the money. But at some point in time, if your hypothesis is true and we end up with large numbers of people not working, they're going to want something, aren't they? And they'll vote. Now, standard political parties aren't delivering, they'll go for alternatives. And in some states, they'll go for very radical alternatives. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It'll shake the system up. It'll make it more responsive to people's needs.
Yeah, or potentially you could just, take the wealth out of the ether and redistribute it. But, we'll see how likely that is in the UBI and whatnot. But I think, as you said, people like to be engaged in industrious, and just sitting around getting paid is probably not exactly what most people consider a good life. But interesting to watch this development over the next years to come. Just as we are, coming closer to an end here, maybe we are. If you have some, as we talked about initially, business have a huge role to play. There are, the entire private sector is to some, largely responsible for where we are, and they are definitely really core to the solutions and things we need to put in place in order to create a prosperous society, or societies where all humans can flourish. They're embedded and truly a part of this whole joint effort. If you have kind of a few specific advices to investors and chairpersons around the world, things that they should enact now in order to help create prosperous societies, and also maybe help their respective countries grow in the peace index, what would be some of the advice that you would, or the things that you would emphasize that they need to just get started with right now?
So look, one, I'd be looking at the ESG measures within companies which have got higher measures of ESG get better ratings by a lot of the pension funds, superannuation funds, and other investment funds. So that they tend to get higher returns over the longer term. So one, I'd be looking at your ESG strategy. I'd look at not doing it so much for ticking the boxes, but look at it from a practical sense. And how does it make good sense for the business business. Okay, and that way you likely get those sustainable results. I'd be looking at the like from our angle, we'd be looking at the positive piece of countries and what the momentum of it, where is it improving and how strongly it's improving, because that gives you a better idea of which markets are going to have more solid growth over the longer term. It's we can certainly see the countries which are improving in positive peace. We look at the value of their stock markets. Over a decade, they got 34% higher return than the global average. And and so I'd be, even if you don't use the positive peace framework, you could use other frameworks which look at sort of how healthy and functioning these broader social dynamics of a society is, because in the long run that determines your economic outcomes. So they'll be looking at that. I think one of the things too is one of the things we can see within societies, there's tipping points, and sort of you can do things and it doesn't have much effect up to a certain point, then small amount more of that has profound changes. You can see it in relationship to corruption and peace. You can see it in relation to, let's say, positive peace and per capita income. See it in a whole range of other things. But from a business perspective, sort of looking at industries which sort of seem to be hanging on now, but seem to be on the nose, they'll have a tipping point where they'll go very, very fast. So people, if you're engaged in those industries around the periphery, look at where can you make the change. So you make the change prior to hitting that tipping point. Because when you hit the tipping point, it goes fast.
Interesting. Yeah, no, then it seems like we have, well, certainly on the climate side, I mean, the time to act is now, and the tipping point is just getting closer and closer. So we need to get together and address some of these crucial issues urgently. But to conclude, I mean, you have written this great book. I found it fascinating. It's not only it's your story. But it also lays out the whole argument for why peace makes economic sense. The difference between peace as traditionally understood as the absence of violence, but really framing the concept of positive peace, and there's a different, to some extent, very different things. What next? Where do you go now? I mean, you have published this great book. What will take your attention going forward?
Well, we're putting a lot of energy into systems and trying to understand the societies from the way they operate as systems. And look, it's a profound, probably haven't got enough time now, but the philosophy of it's profoundly different for understanding how societies operate from the way we do it today. A lot of people understand systems, think they understand systems, and sort of see systems everywhere. But when you get into the detail of it, it's truly a philosophically different approach to understanding how societies operate. So we're putting a lot of research into that currently. So that for us is exceptionally important. We're moving further into understanding ecological threats, and particularly its relationship with the conflict. And ecological threats stand separate from climate change. Climate change will exaggerate ecological threats. So they're particularly important in areas like food, just some simple ones like food, water, overpopulation. They all form into this dynamic mix, which then gets sort of exacerbated or exaggerated by climate change. So putting a lot of work in there. We want to start looking at the food production systems to get a better feel of what areas are likely to implode. Because as we move forward, we can see there are 17 countries in sub-Saharan Africa which will more than double their population in the next 30 years. And if we look at the area, the two countries with the most ecological conflicts, they're Yemen and Syria. Okay, and so it drives home this relationship between the ecological degradation and conflict. And so part of the solution to this is how do you capture more water economically, because from that now you can grow more agriculture, and how do you decrease the bludgeoning population rates in these countries as well. So we want to put more energy into studying and understanding those things, and also sort of looking at sort of measures of well-being or happiness. So two ways of doing it. One is basically works off surveys, but like surveys are hit and miss in a lot of countries. People won't tell you what they really think. Or you'd use socio-economic measures, so measures of child mortality rates, education rates, per capita income, etc., etc., etc. But there again, they're not really a measure of well-being or happiness, they're a measurement of material success. So one of the things we want to look at and starting to look at is trying to use facial recognition techniques to be able to determine the stress or happiness in someone's face. You can do that now. You've got the ability to move that through different societies, get a better understanding of what societies are happiest, and then you can start to understand the socio-dynamics around those societies. Because certainly as I move through a lot of the Western democracies, I don't see people who look as happy as some of the really poor people I meet in Africa.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing with human nature, isn't it? That you can be in the most miserable position and still be happy and content, or you can be in the most affluent and still be very miserable. I mean, that's that never ceases to surprise me. That in particular, you across the global south, it's the level of joy that many people have in situations that we would, be very, not wanted to live in, but they seem to have this love for life. So, yeah, no, it's a human happiness can exist in many strange places. And this has been wonderful speaking to you. You've written a really an interesting book. I would highly recommend it to everyone, and not least to business people. I mean, I think it is very important that we bridge this divide, if you will, between the traditional kind of academic side to human security and peach research and all these, and the business side. And you make a very compelling argument for why businesses should step up and why their future depends on it. And there is no business in a failing society, and they just need to understand that. And as you said, take the immediate actions they can, adopting the SDGs, or at least looking to sustainability and start changing their business practices. To round off, what are the few reasons that you are really happy or optimistic about our future? I mean, it's hard to be kind of dragged down in this kind of with all the challenges in the news, and it's easy to get kind of dragged into a kind of a bit of a pessimistic spiral. But I happen to be an optimist. I think it is within our reach to address all these issues, although challenging. But in your mind, what are some really immediate reasons to be optimistic?
Well, look, I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic. I think a lot of it depends where you are as to the trajectory of the society you're on. Okay, so that's sort of like sitting down here in Australia, for example. We've virtually got no COVID-19. Okay, we get one case break out and the whole country goes into hysterics, and you get areas locked down until it disappears. Okay, so we had one case in my state in New South Wales about 4 days ago, and so everyone went hysterical, but life is pretty much normal, very, very different than what everyone in Europe's experiencing. So I think the things which makes me probably confident for the future is sort of the ability of human beings to adapt. One of our issues is we don't tend to adapt until we have a problem. Okay, so our ability to act on what we can see as a future problem is pretty poor. Okay, pretty poor. But we do have the ability to act and adapt on problems. So I think this part of the human nature, which is adaptable. The other part is we're inventive. Okay, and as a species, quite often we're always looking for a problem to solve. And so those kind of things, give me hope. I think the things which concern me is, I guess, just the average human beings think we're a lot more intelligent than what we are. And we're also tend to be a lot more selfish than what we should be. So that'd be the two things which worry me the most. Okay, it's like a lot of the time we think we're so much smarter than what we are, and the less information we've got, the smarter we think we are too, quite often. And the other thing is just quite often how we can just really act in our own self-interest, but quite often it's short-term self-interest without looking at our self-interest in a more enlightened way, if you like.
Well, Steve, just to round off, is there any for our viewers any place that people can find more information about your work, or your where would you like to point them to?
Sure, there's a number of places people can go. We have a website called visionofhumanity.org, so we've got everything up there. Could also do searches on the Institute for Economics and Peace. You could also just search on the Global Peace Index or the Global Terrorism Index. That'll get you there as well. You could also, the book, Peace in the Age of Chaos. I don't think I've mentioned it, but it basically there's a number of different themes running through it. The first one's an entrepreneurial story about how to build a think tank, a global think tank, which in its area is probably the leading one in the world. It's a story of a personal adventure in many of the developing parts of the world. It's also a story of why economics and peace are really closely interlinked, and why positive peace combined with systems thinking is a transformational concept which can change the way we go about running and developing our societies.
Thank you, Steve. Again, it's a great pleasure to speak with you. You have written a really interesting book, as you it's readable for many reasons. I urge everyone to pick it up, and this is really the time to kind of reconsider our dealings with peace, and why the time is now to act on it, and we all can do our bits, not least businesses around the world. So just thank you for your work, thank you for your book, and it's lovely talking to you, and I hope to see you in Oslo during our next Business for Peace summit, when we convene physically in the next year in 2022.
Well,
so
certainly hope to be there. It'll be good fun again.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to you in Australia.
Thanks, Marius. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.